President William Harrison stood in front of the tall mirror in his hotel room. He adjusted his tie for the 5th time that morning. Today was the big day. He was visiting the Kingdom of Valdoria for the first time as president. The small European nation was famous for its ancient traditions and very serious royal guards. William had been president for 2 years now. He was known for being friendly and wanting to connect with people, but sometimes his friendly nature got him into funny situations. His chief of staff, Sarah Chen, had warned him many times to follow protocol exactly. But William always thought he could make things better with his personal touch. The morning sun shone through the expensive hotel windows. William could see the royal palace in the distance. Its golden towers sparkled in the light. Today he would meet King Frederick and participate in the traditional welcome ceremony. The ceremony had been done the same way for over 300 years. Sarah knocked on his door. She entered carrying a thick folder of papers. Her face looked worried as always when they traveled to formal countries. She had been his chief of staff since he became president. She knew him well enough to be concerned about his creative ideas. "William, this is very important," Sarah said, placing the folder on the table. "The people of Valdoria take their traditions very seriously. The royal guards have been protecting their kings for centuries. They never break their serious expressions. They never move unless ordered. They are like living statues." William nodded, but he was not really listening. He was thinking about how impressive it would be if he could make those famous guards smile. He had heard stories about how no one had ever made them laugh or even change their facial expressions. It seemed like a fun challenge to him. The folder contained detailed instructions about the ceremony. William was supposed to walk slowly up the palace steps. He would inspect the guard line. He would nod respectfully to each guard. Then he would wait for the king at the top of the steps. It was all very formal and boring in William's opinion. Sarah continued reading the instructions. The guards wear red uniforms with gold buttons. They have tall black hats with white feathers. They carry ceremonial swords that are very sharp. They stand perfectly still for hours without moving. The people of Valdoria are very proud of their guards' discipline. William walked to the window and looked out at the palace again. He could see tiny figures in red uniforms standing like statues in front of the building. From this distance, they looked like toy soldiers, but he knew they were real men who took their job very seriously. His phone buzzed with a text message from his wife back home. She wrote, "Good luck today, honey. Try not to do anything too creative." William smiled. Even his wife knew about his tendency to add his own special touches to formal events. The hotel room service brought breakfast. William ate quickly while Sarah reviewed the schedule one more time. After breakfast, they would drive to the palace. The ceremony would begin at exactly 11 o'clock. There would be cameras from around the world watching. Any mistake would be seen by millions of people. William put on his best dark blue suit. He chose his most formal tie with small American flags on it. He looked in the mirror one more time. He looked presidential enough, but something was missing. He felt like he needed to do something special to make this visit memorable. Sarah gathered her papers and headed toward the door. "The car is waiting downstairs," she said. "Remember, William, just follow the protocol. Walk slowly. Nod respectfully. Wait for the king. Don't try to be creative today." William followed her to the door but stopped for a moment. He looked back at the mirror and straightened his shoulders. He had an idea forming in his mind. It was probably not a good idea, but it was definitely an interesting one. He thought about those serious guards who never smiled or moved. The elevator ride down to the lobby was quiet. Sarah was reading her notes again. William was thinking about his plan. He wondered if he could really make those famous guards react. It would be a great story to tell back home, but it might also cause an international incident. The hotel lobby was full of security people and reporters. Cameras flashed as William walked through. Everyone wanted to capture the American president on his way to meet the king. William waved and smiled, but his mind was still thinking about the guards. The presidential car was waiting outside. It was a long black vehicle with American flags on the front. The driver held the door open as William and Sarah got inside. The car began moving slowly through the streets of the capital city. Through the car windows, William could see people lining the streets. They waved small flags and cheered as the motorcade passed. Children held signs welcoming the American president. It was a warm and friendly reception that made William feel good about his visit, but his mind kept returning to the challenge of the Royal Guards. He had read that they were trained from childhood to never show emotion. They practiced standing, still for hours. They memorized hundreds of rules about proper behavior. They were the most disciplined soldiers in the world. The car turned a corner and suddenly the palace was right in front of them. It was much bigger than it looked from the hotel window. The Red Guards were standing in a perfect line up the marble steps. They looked exactly like Sarah had described. Red uniforms, gold buttons, tall black hats, and serious faces. William took a deep breath as the car stopped at the bottom of the palace steps. This was it. In a few minutes he would walk up those steps and inspect the guard line. He would have his chance to try his idea. He just hoped it would work out better than some of his other creative moments. The car door opened and President William Harrison stepped out onto the red carpet. The palace steps stretched up before him like a marble mountain. 20 royal guards stood in perfect formation along both sides of the steps. Each guard looked exactly the same. Red uniform, gold buttons, tall black hat with white feather and a face that showed no emotion at all. Sarah Chen walked beside him, whispering last-minute reminders. "Remember to walk slowly," she said. "Stop at each guard for exactly 3 seconds. Nod once, then move to the next guard. Do not speak to them. Do not touch them. Do not try to make them laugh." William nodded, but he was not really listening. He was studying the guards carefully. They stood so still they could have been made of stone. Their eyes looked straight ahead. Their hands held their ceremonial swords at exactly the same angle. Even their breathing seemed to be perfectly synchronized. The first guard was a tall young man with blonde hair visible under his hat. William stopped in front of him and nodded as instructed. The guard did not even blink. His blue eyes stared past William as if he was not there at all. William moved to the next guard. This guard was older with gray hair and a small scar on his chin. William nodded again. Still no reaction. The guard might as well have been a statue in a museum. William began to understand why these guards were famous around the world. Their discipline was incredible. As William continued up the steps, he started to feel disappointed. These guards were so serious that his plan might not work at all. But then he remembered something his grandfather had told him long ago. "Everyone has something that makes them human," he had said. "You just have to find the right button to push." William reached the middle of the steps where the youngest guard was standing. This guard looked like he was barely 20 years old. His uniform was perfect, but William noticed something interesting. The young man's left eye twitched very slightly when a butterfly landed on his sword handle. That tiny twitch gave William hope. If this super-disciplined guard could react to a butterfly, maybe William's plan had a chance after all. He continued up the steps, studying each guard more carefully. He was looking for any sign of humanity beneath their stone-like exteriors. Near the top of the steps, William found what he was looking for. One of the guards was trying very hard not to sneeze. William could see the man's nostrils flaring slightly. His eyes were watering just a tiny bit. The guard was fighting against his body's natural reaction with all his willpower. William's plan suddenly became clear in his mind. These guards were trained to ignore everything around them. They practiced not reacting to loud noises, bright lights, and even physical discomfort. But there was one thing they probably had not trained for. Something so unexpected that even their incredible discipline might not be ready for it. Sarah was getting nervous as she noticed William taking longer than planned at each guard position. The schedule called for exactly 3 seconds per guard. William was already behind time and the king would be appearing soon. The ceremony had to start on time, or it would throw off the entire royal protocol. William reached the top of the steps where he was supposed to wait for King Frederick. The palace doors were enormous, made of dark wood with gold decorations. Through the glass windows, William could see movement inside. The king was probably getting ready to make his grand entrance. But instead of taking his position and waiting, William's creative mind was working overtime. He looked back down the line of guards. They had all returned to their statue-like poses after his inspection, but he had seen those tiny signs of humanity. The eye twitch, the almost sneeze, the slight breathing changes. Sarah moved closer to William and spoke in an urgent whisper. "The king will be here in 2 minutes," she said. "Please just stand in your designated spot and wait. The whole world is watching this ceremony. We cannot afford any mistakes or surprises." William smiled at Sarah, but his eyes were still focused on the guards. He had made his decision. His plan was probably crazy, but it might just work. And if it worked, it would be a story that people would tell for years. If it failed well, at least it would be an interesting failure. The palace doors began to open. Slowly, King Frederick was about to make his appearance. This was William's last chance to execute his plan. He took a deep breath and made his move. Instead of staying in his proper position, William suddenly started walking back down the steps. But he was not walking normally. He was walking in a very strange and funny way. He kept his upper body perfectly, straight and serious like a soldier. But his feet were doing something completely different. William was doing what looked like a combination of a military march and a silly dance. His left foot would step normally. Then his right foot would do a little skip. Then his left foot would take a big step. Then his right foot would do a tiny shuffle. It was the most ridiculous walking style anyone had ever seen. The first guard William passed tried to keep his stone face, but his eyes moved slightly to track William's bizarre movement. The second guard actually blinked twice in confusion. By the third guard, William's strange walking had become even more elaborate. Now William was adding arm movements to his weird walk. His left arm swung normally like a soldier. His right arm moved like he was stirring soup. His face remained completely serious and presidential, as if this was perfectly normal behavior for meeting a king. Sarah stood at the top of the steps with her mouth open in shock. She could not believe what she was seeing. The president of the United States was doing some kind of interpretive dance down the palace steps in front of the most disciplined guards in Europe. The guards were starting to crack. The young guard with the twitchy eye was now trying very hard not to smile. The older guard with the scar was breathing faster than normal. The guard who had almost sneezed was now biting his lip to keep from laughing. But William was not finished, yet. As he reached the bottom of the steps, he suddenly turned around and started walking back up. This time, his walking style was even more creative. He was now doing what looked like a cross between a tango and a chicken dance, while maintaining perfect presidential posture. King Frederick appeared in the palace doorway, just in time to see President Harrison performing his unique walking exhibition. The king's face showed complete confusion. In 300 years of royal ceremonies, nothing like this had ever happened before. The guards were losing their battle against laughter. One by one, their stone faces began to crack. The young guard snorted. The older guard coughed to hide a chuckle. The almost sneezing guard was now shaking with suppressed laughter. William had found their human button, and he was pushing it with all his might. The moment King Frederick stepped onto the palace balcony, everything changed. The king was a tall man with silver hair and a magnificent blue uniform covered in medals. He had been preparing for this ceremony all morning. He expected to see the American president standing respectfully at attention, waiting for the formal greeting. Instead, King Frederick saw President William Harrison doing what appeared to be some kind of traditional American dance down his palace steps. The king blinked several times, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him. In his 60 years of life and 30 years as king, he had never seen anything like this. The royal guards were now in complete chaos. The young guard at the bottom of the steps had given up trying to hide his smile. His lips were twitching uncontrollably. As he watched the president add even more creative moves to his walking routine, the guard was biting his tongue to keep from bursting out laughing. William had now reached the middle of the steps again. He decided to add a new element to his performance. While maintaining his serious presidential expression, he began to move his shoulders in a rhythmic pattern. His left shoulder would go up while his right shoulder went down. Then they would switch positions in perfect timing with his unusual footwork. The older guard with the gray hair and scar was breathing heavily. Now, his chest was moving up and down rapidly as he fought against the laughter building inside him. Sweat was forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His hands were gripping his ceremonial sword so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. Sarah Chen stood frozen at the top of the steps watching her worst nightmare come true. The chief of staff had planned hundreds of diplomatic events, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. She could see reporters in the distance taking photos and videos. Tomorrow the whole world would see these images of the American president, dancing on the palace steps. King Frederick slowly walked to the edge of his balcony to get a better view. He was trying to understand what was happening. Perhaps this was some new American diplomatic tradition he had not been told about. Maybe President Harrison was performing a special dance to show respect for the Valdorian people. But as the king watched more carefully, he began to realize that this was not a planned ceremony. The American president's movements were too random and silly to be an official dance. This was something else entirely. Something that was making his legendary royal guards lose their legendary composure. The guard who had been fighting the urge to sneeze was now shaking with silent laughter. His whole body was vibrating as he tried to maintain his position. Tears were forming in his eyes from the effort of holding back his reaction. The ceremonial feather in his hat was trembling from his barely controlled movements. William noticed the guard's reactions and decided to take his performance to the next level. He began to add facial expressions to his routine while keeping his body movements going. He would raise one eyebrow while lowering the other. Then he would puff out his cheeks like a chipmunk. Then he would wiggle his nose like a rabbit. The combination of William's serious presidential posture with his ridiculous facial expressions and bizarre walking style was too much for the guards to handle. The first guard actually made a small giggling sound before quickly covering his mouth with his hand. The sound echoed off the marble steps like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. King Frederick heard the giggle and realized what was happening. The American president was intentionally trying to make his guards laugh. The king had heard stories about President Harrison being unconventional, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. The man was actually succeeding in breaking the iron discipline of the royal guard. The second guard let out a snort of laughter that he tried to turn into a cough, but it was too late. The sound of suppressed laughter was spreading down the line of guards like a wave. Each guard was fighting his own private battle against the humor that was threatening to overwhelm their training. Sarah realized she had to do something before the situation got completely out of control. She began walking quickly down the steps toward William. Her high heels clicked rapidly on the marble as she tried to reach him before he could do any more damage to American diplomatic relations. But William saw Sarah coming and decided to include her in his performance. As she approached him, he began to mirror her movements. When she took a quick step, he took a quick step. When she raised her hand to signal him to stop, he raised his hand in the same gesture. When she frowned, he frowned back at her. The guards were now openly struggling to maintain their positions. The young guard was bending forward slightly, trying to hide his face. The older guard was looking up at the sky as if he was praying for strength. The almost sneezing guard had tears streaming down his cheeks from the effort of not laughing out loud. King Frederick made a decision. He could either be offended by this breach of protocol, or he could appreciate the humor of the situation. The Chaurisi, American president, had managed to do something that no one had ever done before. He had made the royal guards show emotion during a formal ceremony. The king began to smile. It started as a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. Then it grew into a genuine grin as he watched his perfectly disciplined guards struggling not to laugh at the silly American president. The situation was so absurd that even the king was beginning to find it funny. William's performance reached its peak as he arrived back at the top of the steps near Sarah. He executed a perfect military salute while simultaneously doing a little dance step with his feet. The combination of formal respect and complete silliness was the final straw for the guards. The youngest guard broke first. He let out a loud laugh that he immediately tried to cover with both hands. But the sound had escaped and there was no taking it back. The laughter was infectious and it spread to the next guard and then the next. Within seconds, the entire line of royal guards was laughing. Some were trying to hide their faces. Others were shaking with silent giggles. A few had given up completely and were laughing openly while still trying to maintain their formal positions. The sound of 20 royal guards laughing echoed across the palace courtyard. It was a sound that had never been heard before in the 300-year history of the welcome ceremony. The most disciplined soldiers in Europe had been defeated by an American president's silly walk. Sarah finally reached William and grabbed his arm. She was ready to drag him away from the scene of his diplomatic disaster. But as she looked around at the laughing guards and the smiling king, she realized something unexpected. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. Even the serious reporters in the distance were smiling as they took pictures of the unprecedented scene. The people watching from the streets were clapping and cheering. What had started as a potential international incident was turning into something much more positive. King Frederick watched the amazing scene unfolding below him and made a decision that would surprise everyone. Instead of being angry about the broken protocol, he began to walk down from his balcony to join the chaos. The king had spent 30 years following the same boring ceremonies over and over again. This was the most interesting thing that had happened at his palace in decades. The royal guards were still laughing, but now they were also looking worried. They had broken the most important rule of their training: never show emotion during a formal ceremony. Some of them were already thinking about the punishment they would receive later. The youngest guard was trying to stop laughing and return to his serious pose, but every time he looked at President Harrison, he started giggling again. William noticed the king coming down the steps and realized this was a critical moment. His silly plan had worked better than he had hoped. The guards were laughing and even the king was smiling. But now he needed to turn this chaos back into something that looked like a real diplomatic meeting. Sarah was still holding William's arm and whispering urgently in his ear. "You need to fix this right now," she said. "The king is coming and you need to show proper respect. Stop with the dancing and acting normal. The whole world is watching, and we need to save this situation somehow." But William had a different idea. Instead of returning to boring protocol, he decided to include King Frederick in his creative approach to diplomacy. As the king walked down the steps, William began to walk up to meet him. But he was still doing his special walk with the funny footwork and arm movements. The crowd of people watching from the street was getting larger. Word had spread quickly through the capital city that something unusual was happening at the palace. Shopkeepers had left their stores. Office workers had come out of their buildings. Children had run from the nearby park. Everyone wanted to see what the American president was doing to make the royal guards laugh. King Frederick reached the middle of the steps just as William arrived at the same spot. The two leaders faced each other while the laughing guards tried to compose themselves around them. This was the moment when the formal greeting was supposed to happen. But nothing about this ceremony was formal anymore. William looked directly at King Frederick and did something completely unexpected. He began to teach the king his silly walk. First, William demonstrated the basic step: normal left foot, silly right foot. Then he showed the king how to add the arm movements: left arm, normal, right arm, like stirring soup. The king stared at William for a moment, trying to understand what was being asked of him. In all his years of royal training, no one had ever taught him how to do a silly walk. Kings were supposed to be dignified and serious at all times. But something about William's friendly smile and the joyful atmosphere made the king want to try something new. King Frederick took his first attempt at the silly walk. His left foot stepped normally, but his right foot did a small, awkward shuffle. The royal guards, who were still trying to stop laughing, burst into fresh giggles when they saw their dignified king trying to copy the American president's ridiculous movements. William clapped his hands in encouragement and showed the king how to improve his technique. The president was now acting like a dance instructor giving a lesson to his royal student. Sarah watched in amazement as the leader of the free world taught the king of Valdoria how to walk like a circus performer. The king's second attempt was much better. He managed to coordinate his feet with his arms and even added a little shoulder movement. The crowd watching from the street began to cheer and applaud. Children were pointing and laughing with delight. Adults were taking pictures with their phones to capture this historic moment. But the most amazing thing was happening with the royal guards. Seeing their king participate in William's silly performance gave them permission to enjoy themselves, too. Instead of trying to return to their serious poses, they began to smile openly. Some of them were even attempting their own versions of the presidential walk. The oldest guard, who had served the royal family for 25 years, was now doing a version of William's dance that included elements of traditional Valdorian folk dancing. The youngest guard was adding jumping movements that made his ceremonial hat bounce up and down. The guard with the scar was doing arm movements that looked like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. Sarah realized that her careful planning had been completely abandoned, but something wonderful was happening instead. The formal ceremony, that was supposed to show respect between two nations, had turned into a celebration of friendship and human connection. The rigid protocol had been replaced by genuine joy and laughter. News crews from around the world were filming everything. The images of President Harrison teaching King Frederick how to do a silly walk while royal guards danced around them would be broadcast to every country on Earth. But instead of looking like a diplomatic disaster, it looked like the most fun anyone had ever had at a state ceremony. William and King Frederick were now walking together up and down the palace steps doing synchronized silly movements. They had created their own unique diplomatic dance that combined American creativity with Valdorian tradition. The two leaders were laughing and talking like old friends who had known each other for years. The palace staff, who had been watching from windows, were now coming outside to join the celebration. Butlers were attempting their own versions of the silly walk. Maids were clapping and cheering. Even the serious royal advisors were smiling and taking pictures with their phones. King Frederick stopped his dancing for a moment and looked at William with genuine appreciation. In 30 years of being king, he had met hundreds of world leaders. Most of them were boring politicians who only cared about making themselves look important. But President Harrison was different. He was someone who cared more about making people happy than following rules. The king made an announcement that surprised everyone, including his own staff. He declared that from now on, every welcome ceremony at the palace would include a friendship dance. New visitors would be invited to create their own special walk with the king. The royal guards would be allowed to smile and laugh during ceremonies instead of standing like statues. William felt proud of what his crazy plan had accomplished. He had not only made the famous royal guards laugh, but he had also helped a king discover that leadership could be fun. The boring old ceremony had been transformed into something that brought people together, instead of keeping them apart. Sarah looked at her watch and realized they were now running very late for the rest of their scheduled events. But as she watched the continued celebration happening around her, she decided that some things were more important than keeping a tight schedule. Sometimes the best diplomacy happened when you threw away the rule book and just let people be human together. The silly walk had become a symbol of friendship between America and Valdoria. But more importantly, it had shown that even the most serious people in the world needed to laugh sometimes. 6 months later, the world was still talking about the day President William Harrison made the royal guards laugh. Videos of the silly walk ceremony had been watched by over 1 billion people on the internet. Late-night talk show hosts were still making jokes about it. Children in playgrounds around the world were practicing their own versions of the presidential dance. But the real changes were happening in the Kingdom of Valdoria itself. King Frederick had kept his promise about making ceremonies more fun. Every official visit now included a friendship dance. Diplomats from serious countries like Germany and Japan found themselves doing silly walks with the king. Even the most formal ambassadors could not resist smiling when they participated in the new Valdorian tradition. The royal guards had become celebrities in their own right. The young guard who had been the first to laugh was now featured in tourism, advertisements for the country. People came from all over Europe just to see the famous guards who were allowed to show emotion during ceremonies. The palace gift shop sold toy guards that danced when you pressed a button. Sarah Chen had initially worried that William's spontaneous performance would damage his reputation as a serious leader. But the opposite had happened. Polls showed that the president's approval ratings had increased significantly after the Valdoria visit. People appreciated having a leader who was not afraid to be human and make others happy. The palace steps where the silly walk had taken place became a popular tourist destination. Every day, hundreds of visitors came to try their own versions of the presidential dance. The marble steps were now marked with bronze footprints showing the exact path William had taken during his famous performance. King Frederick had discovered something important about leadership that day. He learned that people respected him more when he showed his human side, rather than just his royal dignity. The king began appearing at public events where he would demonstrate the friendship dance with local citizens. Children especially loved meeting a king who would play and laugh with them. The relationship between America and Valdoria had never been stronger. Trade agreements that had been stuck in negotiations for years were suddenly completed within weeks of the Silly Walk incident. Both countries wanted to build on the positive feelings created by that memorable day. Cultural exchange programs were established, allowing American students to study in Valdoria and Valdorian students to visit America. President Harrison received invitations from kings and presidents around the world who wanted to experience their own version of the friendship dance. The rigid world of international diplomacy was slowly becoming more relaxed and human. Leaders were discovering that they could accomplish more by connecting as people, rather than just as political figures. The youngest royal guard had become something of a folk hero in Valdoria. His genuine laugh on that famous day had been so infectious and joyful that people still talked about it. He received letters from children asking for his autograph. Marriage proposals arrived from romantic women who found his ability to find joy irresistible. The guard remained humble about his sudden fame, but he was proud to have been part of something that made so many people happy. William's wife had initially been worried about the videos of her husband dancing on the palace steps. But when she saw how much joy the Silly Walk brought to people around the world, she realized her husband had done something truly special. She began incorporating similar spontaneous moments of fun into her own official duties as First Lady. The older guard with the gray hair and scar had retired from active duty, but stayed on as a trainer for new recruits. His first lesson for every new guard was about the importance of being human even while maintaining discipline. He would tell the story of the day the American president taught them that strength and joy could exist together. Sarah Chen had learned to build extra time into the president's schedule for spontaneous moments of connection with people. She realized that William's natural instinct to make others happy was actually one of his greatest diplomatic tools. The chief of staff began encouraging other world leaders to be more flexible and personal in their interactions. The bronze statue that was erected on the palace grounds showed President Harrison and King Frederick doing their friendship dance together. Children would come to the statue every day to practice their own silly walks. The inscription on the base read, "In celebration of the day, laughter defeated protocol and friendship conquered formality." King Frederick had started a new tradition, called happiness diplomacy, where visiting leaders were encouraged to do something fun and memorable during their visits. One prime minister planted flowers in the royal garden while doing a gardening dance. Another president played a violin concert while marching around the palace courtyard. Each visit created new positive memories and stronger relationships between countries. The guard who had almost sneezed during the original ceremony became the palace's official instructor for the friendship dance. Visitors would receive lessons from him before meeting the king. His classes were always full of laughter as diplomats and tourists learned to coordinate silly walking movements with proper respect. William often reflected on that day and how a simple decision to make people laugh had changed so many lives. He had learned that sometimes the best way to show respect for others was to help them remember how to be joyful. The Silly Walk had accomplished more for international relations than years of serious negotiations might have achieved. The annual Valdorian Friendship Festival was established to commemorate the day the Royal Guards learned to laugh. Every year on that date, people from around the world would gather at the palace to perform their own creative dances and celebrate the power of human connection. The festival had become one of the most popular events in Europe. Years later, when historians wrote about President Harrison's time in office, they would describe the Valdoria visit as a turning point in modern diplomacy. It showed that world leaders could be both serious about their responsibilities and joyful in their interactions with others. The Silly Walk had proven that laughter truly was a universal language. The friendship between America and Valdoria continued to grow stronger with each passing year. Joint projects in science education and cultural exchange flourished. The two countries had become an example of how different nations could work together when they focused on what connected them rather than what divided them. William Harrison would go on to serve 2 full terms as president, but he was always remembered, most for the day he made the Royal Guards laugh. It became his greatest legacy, not because it was the most important thing he did, but because it showed the world that even the most powerful people could choose kindness and joy over rigid tradition. The silly walk lived on in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it either in person or through the countless videos shared around the world. It reminded people that sometimes the most profound changes come not from serious speeches or formal agreements, but from simple moments of human connection and shared laughter. And in the Kingdom of Valdoria, the Royal Guards still smile during ceremonies, knowing that their job is not just to protect the king, but to help create joy for everyone who visits their beautiful palace.